Right.
Oh, it's totally fun. Third chapter, all about needs. Because it's all still like dead on
Right.
butcher's feelings. Yeah, it's really fun.
How long ago?
That's what I was thinking recently. Oh my God, there's so much culture. It's like clearly about.
That's why I like how much you have to show the because you know what's going to do like that. And you know you won't see any sun. The sun throughout the whole year. The sun only shines right next to the moon in the whole year. If you're lucky.
That's why you don't have skin cancer. I usually grown up in the South.
Oh my God, yeah, I think a couple of teachers south of
Yes. We started
Well, good afternoon. I hope you were all sufficiently fortified for what's to come. So we begin our second subset, Facture and Function, Making and Meaning of the Eucharist series. And our first speaker is Betsy Weissman. She's curator of Dutch painting at the National Gallery in London. She has written extensively on 17th century Dutch portraiture and genre painting, with specific focus on the work of Gerard ter Borch and Gaspar Netscher. Did I say that right? Close enough? Yeah, I know. We're the despair of our Dutch registrar. She has also curated a number of exhibitions devoted to 17th century Dutch and Flemish painting, including Drawn by the Brush, which focus on the oil sketches of Peter Paul Rubens, and most recently, Vermeer's Women, Secrets and Silence, at the Fitzwilliams Museum at Cambridge. Betsy.
Thank you, Maureen. As with the other of today's speakers, I'd like to do the roster of thanks because very many people were involved in the preparations for my talk. First of all, I'd like to thank Virginia for her invitation, and Maureen, Barbara, and Sonia for their technical assistance in, not least in getting images to me, because unlike people with an academic association, I don't have access to JSTOR and ArtStore and things like that. Also, I'd like to thank colleagues Martha Wolf at the Art Institute of Chicago, Alejandro Vergara at the Prado, David Scrace at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and Rupert Featherston at the Hamilton Carr Institute for Conservation in Cambridge for their help in images and also research. So let me, sorry. Arrow. Will that do it?
No, I think arrow.
Oh, arrow. Minor technical glitch. Okay. Although it comes at the midpoint of the day, my talk today is somewhat of an introduction to more in-depth studies of Rubens' Triumph of the Eucharist series that are being presented by the other speakers in today's program. I hope to provide you with a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at how Rubens translated the gem of an idea, which might have originated in a personal conversation or a very broadly worded document, into an elaborate and intricately detailed ensemble of tapestries celebrating the Eucharist for the convent of the Descalzas Reales in Madrid. This was, as we know, an extraordinarily complex undertaking, the magnitude of which is made vividly clear when you realize that the earliest designs we know of for the project are tiny oil sketches scarcely 6 inches high, and the end result is a set of tapestries well over 15 feet high, a dramatic transformation not only of scale but of medium. And you're not meant to be able to see, actually, the image at the lower left of the screen, just to give you a sense of the relative size of the preliminary sketch or bozzetto for the finished tapestry. Such an undertaking might have felled a mere mortal, but we all know that Rubens was an extraordinary man. In addition to his formidable artistic talents, he was gregarious, erudite, highly cultured, well-connected, and not least, a savvy entrepreneur with a seemingly limitless capacity for multitasking. And I always think that it is a great indication of his personal charisma that people didn't hate him. Still, even Rubens would have found it impossible to complete even a fraction of the projects he took on without the assistance of a large and very efficient studio. "I am the busiest and most harassed man in the world," he commented ruefully in a letter of January 1625, but nonetheless he devised a number of ways to cope with the incessant demand for his work. The Danish physician Otto Sperling, who visited Rubens's studio in 1621, described the activities of the myriad studio assistants who enabled Rubens to achieve such a high level of productivity. Quote, "A good number of young men, each occupied on a different work, for which Rubens had provided a chalk drawing with touches of color added here and there. The young men had to work these up fully in paint until finally Mr. Rubens would add the last touches with the brush and colors. All this is considered Rubens's work. Thus he has gained a large fortune, and kings and princes have heaped gifts and jewels upon him." One can't help but wonder if Rubens's contemporaries admired his pragmatism, ingenuity, and organizational skills as much as his artistic genius. Moreover, Rubens apparently derived great satisfaction from taking on these large projects and strategizing their execution. I confess that by natural instinct, I am more inclined to execute very large works rather than small curiosities, he noted. My talent is such that no undertaking, no matter how large in size, how varied in subject, has ever exceeded my confidence. And this is from a letter dated 13 September 1621. I know he's not humble. He really must have been an amazing person not to hate him. Anyway, the magnificent tapestry commission that is the Triumph of the Eucharist series would certainly have given Rubens's, quote, natural instincts a full workout. And our pair is back again. The Archduchess Isabella ordered the Triumph of the Eucharist tapestries as a gift to the convent in Madrid where she had been educated as a girl and where she hoped to retire to. Although written documentation is lacking, Rubens may have received the commission in July 1625 when Isabella visited the artist at his home in Antwerp, as we've heard, to have her portrait painted. It was probably the Archduchess, famously devout and well familiar with the particular devotions of the Descalzas Reales convent, who suggested the basic theme, but it would have been left to Rubens to elaborate upon it, to decide the number and nature of the various narrative and allegorical scenes that comprise the suite of tapestries. Specifics of the chapel architecture would probably have come from authorities at the convent itself, and the iconographic program was probably refined in consultation with the Archduchess's religious advisors. We don't know if at this stage a date was agreed upon for the completion of the project and delivery of the finished tapestries, and maybe Anna will enlighten us in due course. But from the documents that survive that I've been able to access, we can piece together an approximate chronology for the commission, which culminated in the dispatch of finished tapestries from Brussels on 19th of July, 1628, just over 3 years from the date Rubens first received the order. Given the magnitude of the project and the importance of the client, not to mention the amount of time necessary for the actual weaving of the tapestries, Rubens probably began working on the designs almost immediately. The preliminary work was done probably between August 1625 and February 1626, when Rubens was resident in Brussels, close to both the court of the Archduchess and the workshops where the tapestries were to be woven. The series Rubens conceived consisted of 20 tapestries, 11 large tapestries, as Virginia showed us, with narrative scenes depicting illustrations and prefigurations of the Eucharist, which were probably hung on the lateral walls of the convent's chapel, and 5 narrower tapestries which were hung on the wall behind the chapel's high altar. The placement of the remaining 4 tapestries is less certain, although, again, Anna may enlighten us about that as well. Nonetheless, it seems clear that the tapestries were intended to more or less cover the interior walls of the chapel and transform what was a rather plain and simple interior into a sumptuous illusion of lush tapestry suspended from entirely fictive architecture. As a group, the tapestries present a multifaceted celebration of the Eucharist, one of the most important tenets of Counter-Reformation Catholic theology, and a particular devotion of both the Habsburgs and the Archduchess Isabella. Unfortunately, no contemporary written or visual record survives which might inform us about the intended arrangement of the tapestries within the chapel, and the architecture of the chapel itself was so radically modified in the 18th century that we cannot use the physical structure as a guide to understanding the order of the program Rubens devised. Still, we can be sure that he designed all the constituent parts with a coherent, unifying visual and iconographic program in mind. Although written documents are scarce, we certainly can turn to the works themselves to help piece together Rubens' working process. In addition to the tapestries, there are 7 full-scale painted cartoons and 29 preliminary oil sketches relating to the commission that have survived. Rubens set about visualizing the project by means of a series of small, quickly executed sketches painted in oils on prepared wooden panels. And I show you an example that we've seen before from the Art Institute in Chicago. Unlike most artists who might have begun with drawings on paper, Rubens typically worked out his compositions by means of painted oil sketches. These were, without question, the key compositional and organizational tool in Rubens' studio. With them, he could quickly sketch out his ideas for composition, color palette, and distribution of light and shade, and efficiently communicate the essence of his idea, of his design, both to his studio assistants and to his patrons. Generally speaking, these small-scale preparatory works were done in oil paint on a wood panel that had first been prepared with a gesso ground layer and a neutral imprimatura or underpaint. The imprimatura, which is pigment thinly bound in an aqueous proteinaceous medium. I love being able to say that. What that means is basically that the imprimatura is pigment in a water-based medium with the addition of something that has a protein component to it, such as egg yolk, which is typically used in tempera painting. What that does is it chemically bonds with the gesso, which is a sort of chalk-like preparation. and it becomes very hard, very dense, and in essence creates an impermeable barrier so that the oil paints, which are used for the actual design, do not sink into the gesso ground. So it both creates a color and a dense physical barrier. In many of Rubens' oil sketches, the imprimatura, which is the streaky vertical streaks that you see here in this oil sketch, in many of them, the paintings are so hastily and so summarily executed in these oil sketches that the imprimatura is very clearly visible. And the streaky pattern on the surface adds a very characteristic vivacity to the oil sketches that Rubens produced. And I think that these markings of the imprimatura become very consciously a part of the final aesthetic of the piece. Oil sketches are often categorized according to their degree of finish. The least finished, called bozzetti, and I show you an example of one here, were typically the first stage in the design process. They can be quite summary, as you see, often painted solely in grisaille, in monochrome. About a dozen bozzetti for the Eucharist tapestries survive. We know of no preliminary drawings, but some markings in black chalk or thin reddish-brown paint underneath the paint layer on several of the bozzetti for the Eucharist series suggest that even if he did not work out his design on paper, Rubens began with a basic outline made directly on the prepared panel. I show you here a detail from the sketch in the Art Institute in Chicago. You may be able to see in the arms of the angels and also in their musical instruments extending in the center and to the left-hand side of this detail, some of those darker grayish-black underdrawing. After this original initial underdrawing, Rubens then delineated the forms of the composition with swift strokes of paint that evoke the movement and energy of the protagonist with stunning economy. Here again is another detail from this Chicago sketch of the upper center portion, showing a little bit of that economy of means, and also another detail that we see again in these bozzetti. If you look to the top, just above the arch, you see a horizontal line that's drawn in black chalk or graphite. Rubens marked out in squares where the action of his design was going to play out. And here's another sketch for the Abraham and Melchizedek, where you see at the top and bottom, and you might be able to see at the sides, that square inside the columns that marks out essentially the stage set. And outside of these carefully ruled boxes is the area that he elaborated with the illusionistic architectural and sculptural motifs. It's possible, but not at all certain, that Rubens showed these bozzetti to the Archduchess to obtain her approval of the design at a very early stage in the work. Oriented in the same sense as the final tapestries, as we see here, the bozzetti would have given her a good idea of the iconographic program and the overall appearance of the project, as well as the individual narrative and allegorical scenes. Rubens did not create or present these small sketches singly, but grouped together in larger ensembles that offered a scaled-down view of an entire wall of the chapel on a single panel. The most illuminating bozzetto in this regard is again this sketch from the Art Institute in Chicago. Measuring just over a foot square, it plots the original placement of 5 of the smaller tapestries on the wall behind the church's high altar. At the lower right are dignitaries of the church, and at the lower left, princes from the secular realm, all kneeling in adoration of the Holy Sacrament, borne aloft by 2 angels, who are in turn flanked by additional music-making angels. Although it allows for 5 separate tapestries separated by architectural elements and a large undefinable aperture, it is plain that by grouping them together on one panel, Rubens was considering the entire wall as a single thematic unit. The sketch also shows that the tapestries were to be hung in the chapel on 2 levels, rather than in a strictly linear sequence. The fictive architecture on the upper level features those twisted Solomonic columns, while the lower has plain pseudo-Doric columns, a detail that has proved crucial in modern attempts to reconstruct the placement of other tapestries in the chapel. Although the Chicago painting is the only composite sketch from the project to survive intact, the other bozzetti connected with the Eucharist series were evidently also originally joined in similar groupings and were sawn into individual panels at some later time. By matching the wood grain of the panel supports and aligning continuing brush strokes of the imprimatura, for example, it has been possible to show that at the imprimatura stage, that preparation stage, and probably also at the painting stage, 6 of the 7 bozzetti, now in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, were joined in 3 pairs. And that is on the top, the victory of Eucharistic truth matches up with the triumph of the church. Underneath, the triumph of faith matches up with the triumph of divine love. And to the right-hand side, the evangelists match up with the Eucharistic saints. And it's very difficult to see in slides, but you might be able to see some ghosts of horizontal streaks that carry from one to the other. These are just details of the joins. There's an additional slat of wood down the middle that was added to the end of the panels at a later date. And here, again, I hope you're able to see it, but there are horizontal brush strokes, and there's also a very strong vertical stroke at the right-hand edge that matches up on these panels. You'll have to go to the Fitzwilliam and ask them to unframe the panels for you so you can check it out in person. It is not clear whether the panels were cut apart by Rubens himself or at his direction, perhaps to simplify the further development of the individual scenes, or whether it was done for more mundane commercial reasons. Nonetheless, the sawing apart seems to have been done quite early on, as there is evidence that at least some of these bozzetti had been separated before 1652, so only about a decade after Rubens' death. When the panels are joined up, we can see that the design of the individual scenes is in some respects subservient to the overall view. A sweeping progression from left to right, moving in this particular ensemble probably towards the chapel's high altar. There's also an understanding of whether the viewer sees the tapestries from straight on, as would happen in the lower register, or from below, as in the upper register, and a unified sense of the fall of light and shadow. And I think if you look in the background, particularly of the scenes to the left, the 2 that are joined horizontally, you see that there really is a unified sense of movement of those, and that the light seems to flood from one grouping to the other. Even if Rubens did not take the opportunity to show the bozzetti to his royal patron, these composite panels were an essential step that enabled him to map out a complex project in its entirety. Although the tapestries are all the same height, the widths vary considerably. There appears to have been little concern to align them vertically, probably due to the need to accommodate doorways and other structural features in the chapel. Once Rubens had plotted the proposed scheme, each of the scenes depicted Each of the scenes sketched out in the bozzetti was worked up into a larger, more detailed, and highly colored sketch known as a modello. The scenes destined for the lateral wall, and I show you here one of the bozzetti paired with its corresponding modello, and here another example. The scenes destined for the lateral walls of the chapel were reversed at this stage. As the tapestries were woven from the back, as we've heard, the weavers needed to work from a design that was in mirror image to how the finished tapestry would appear in order to preserve the coherent sense of movement in the direction of the high altar. Although for other tapestry projects, Rubens began with a reversed image, for this particular project, he elected to paint the bozzetti in their actual final orientation to better get a grip on the asymmetrical architecture of the chapel and the distribution of natural light within the space. Interestingly, the tapestries for the wall behind the high altar were not reversed at the modello stage, and I show you here an example of a modello in the Speed Museum, and you see that it's in the same orientation as the area to the lower right in the Chicago painting. The designs for this grouping were only reversed when it was translated from the modelli into the large cartoons. Because this one wall presented a more symmetrical arrangement with less specific source of natural light and no need to work out the correct directional progression of the figures, the process of reversal was less tricky and could therefore be entrusted to the studio assistant making the cartoon. Whether by fortuitous gift or assiduous training, Rubens had a remarkable facility for envisioning 2- and 3-dimensional designs from multiple perspectives, and without any seeming effort, could twist and reverse sculpted, painted, or drawn designs like a veritable Rubik's Cube master. There is no evidence that Rubens used a mechanical means to create the reversed modelli from the bozzetti in this project. He did, however, use squaring to enlarge the design, which may in the process have simplified the process of reversal. At roughly 2 feet high, the modelli for the Triumph of the Eucharist tapestries are about 4 times larger than the bozzetti. Although no such marks have been found on the bozzetti for the Eucharist series, a number of bozzetti associated with other projects display regular markings in paint or chalk, or incisions or small holes at the very edges of the panels. And I think you will be able to see some numbers and some markings on these details from the edges of some other bozzetti by Rubens. These markings were used to divide the composition into a grid to aid in making an accurate enlargement of the design. No traces of the grid itself have been found on Rubens's sketches. He probably used chalk, thread, or some other means that would leave no permanent trace upon the panel. But grids are very clearly visible on oil sketches by several of Rubens's colleagues, such as on this sketch by Antony van Dyck. And I think you see in the detail on the left very clearly that grid in the background. Rubens used the modelli to refine his compositions, to develop more fully the gestures and expressions of the figures, to add additional details, and to work out the vivid color palette. He very likely showed these larger, more finished, and more colorful designs to the Archduchess for her approval. Comparing individual modelli with the corresponding bozzetti gives a good idea of how and to what ends Rubens modified and elaborated his designs. This modello of the ecclesiastical hierarchy and adoration from the Speed Museum in Louisville, that's on the right-hand side, is oriented in the same direction as the corresponding portion of the bozzetto in Chicago. Some of the most noticeable changes between the bozzetto and modello concern the number and disposition of the figures. The group of ecclesiastical dignitaries has been reduced in number from 9 to 7. Their gestures are grander, more expansive. Overall, the configuration of the modello is simpler, more monumental, and more dignified than in the Bozzetto, reflecting Rubens's constant concern for refining his compositions for greater impact and narrative clarity. Other modelli reveal more drastic changes. That should load. There we go. Sorry. Go back. Sneak preview. It seems to be getting a little quirky here. Anyway, it should pop up in a second. And if it doesn't, just take my word for it. There are two modelli for the meeting of Abraham and Melchizedek. The one from the Prado, which, yeah, you're not seeing. Let me see if I can get it. No. Okay. The one from the Prado is earlier. It's in was executed earlier. It's in squared format. It has Solomonic columns and was intended to be seen from below, very similar to the Bozzetto. At a certain point, Rubens changed his mind about the placement of this subject within the entire narrative scheme. And that we see reflected in this modello that's in the National Gallery in Washington. The first thing we notice is that the columns are different. They're the Doric columns that we see on the lower register. It's more horizontal in format, more figures have been added, and the entire thing is viewed straight on and not from below. The modelli for the Triumph of the Eucharist Tapestry series are not all finished to the same degree, and even in a single sketch, less important parts were sometimes hardly more worked up than in the initial Bozzetto. Areas repeated from one sketch to the next, such as the architectural framework, are very sensibly and efficiently only fully worked up in one example. Only in the Abraham and Melchizedek in the National Gallery, for example, are the Doric columns we see repeated in all the tapestries destined for the lower register. Only in this sketch are they fully described. And you see a detail from another sketch in Boston that's only very sketchily indicated. The rationale for this variable concern for detail is quite obvious. The studio assistants entrusted with enlarging the modelli into full-scale cartoons would have been among the most advanced and adept painters in Rubens's employ, through experience well accustomed to deciphering the master's visual shorthand and pretty much filling in the blanks. If there was any doubt about the intent, of course, Rubens himself was always there to consult. In some instances, these less finished areas of the modelli were, quote-unquote, completed by a later hand, possibly to make the oil sketches more saleable as independent works. Once he had worked out the designs for the tapestries to his satisfaction, Rubens turned the modelli over to his assistants for translating into the full-scale painted cartoons for the tapestry weavers to work from. 7 of these large cartoons survive, 5 of which are here at the Ringling, and 2 in the museum at Valenciennes. It seems reasonable to assume that the same method of squaring that had been used to enlarge the bozzetti into the modelli was used to produce these enormous paintings, 8 times larger than the modelli. Small pinholes and notches are found at regular intervals around all 4 edges of the Abraham and Melchizedek modello in Washington, for example. As this modello was not created by directly enlarging the bozzetto, as I explained, there were the 2 versions. The presence of the pinholes here suggests that despite some differences in the details, a grid was in fact used to enlarge the design from modello to cartoon. Although one can certainly identify small variations, there were no major changes to the composition introduced at the cartoon stage, which is perfectly understandable considering that they were, for the most part, painted by assistants paying strict attention to the master's modello. Had Rubens alone painted the cartoons, it is hard to imagine that he would have been able to resist the temptation to introduce further changes. This is not to say that Rubens completely removed himself from the project at this stage, however, as he added details and corrective retouchings to the finished paintings before they left the studio. As the individual cartoons were completed, they were rolled up and delivered to the workshops of the tapestry weavers Jan Rees and Jacob Goebbels. For the sake of efficiency, they were probably sent off immediately as they were finished, rather than waiting until the entire series was completed. Work on the tapestries was already underway in Goebbels' workshop by December 1626, but a letter written by Isabella's chaplain, Philip Schifflet, notes that Rubens and assistants, presumably, were still at work on some of the cartoons in May 1627. The series was apparently finished by the end of the year, however, as in January 1628, the Archduchess presented Rubens with a gift of pearls, as Virginia mentioned, and a payment of 30,000 guilders for his designs for the tapestries. With the completion of the painted cartoons and their delivery to the workshops of Rees and Goebbels, the direct involvement of Rubens and his studio in this grand commission was effectively over. But just a few years later, Rubens was to use the same efficient method of production, bozzetto, modello, cartoon, for his fourth and last tapestry series devoted to the life of Achilles. For Rubens, this was the ideal method of efficiently and effectively making the most of both his own creative skills and those of the painters working as assistants in his atelier. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. Well, our next speaker, Ana Garcia Sanz, is the curator of the Monasterio Descalzas Reales, Patrimonio Nacional in Madrid. You get that okay? All right. As the curator of the convent where Rubens' Eucharist series tapestries remain remarkably intact today, Ana is uniquely positioned to offer new insights into these works, some of the most important in her purview. Ana has investigated a great amount of time and energy, not only caring for the tapestries, but investigating their roles in the ritual life of the convent. She has lived with these works and the spaces they once graced, and has thought deeply about and conducted extensive research with an eye towards resolving many of the issues and questions surrounding them. She has published extensively on the tapestries and on the convent that houses them. It's a great pleasure for us to have Ana with us today, who represents sort of the other half, so to speak, of Ringling's great treasures.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this extraordinary symposium, in particular to Maureen, Virginia, and Barbara, and also like to extend my personal thanks to Gabriela, Sonia, and Matthew for their support in different aspects of my paper, and especially with the paperwork. I like to send my appreciation and congratulations for every member of the organizing team. Thank you very much and congratulations. My paper in this symposium focuses on analyzing the way in which the 20 tapestries of the Triumph of the Eucharist were used in different ceremonies and events in the convent of the Descalzas Reales, a building that from its foundation in 1556 was an important point in the religious and political life of the city of Madrid. The first point of my paper relates to the arrival of the tapestries at the convent. For decades, scholars and specialists agreed that the whole series of tapestries arrived in 1628, I believe based on a well-known letter sent that year by Father Chiflet. But more recently, we have discovered new documents concerning this matter. Conserved in the National History Archive in Madrid are the Libros de Paso, where the objects and goods coming from Brussels that passed through customs in Madrid are listed. In these books, the tapestries sent by the Infanta Isabella are mentioned, and it appears that there was one shipment of 4 tapestries in 1632, and 2 more shipments the next year, one of 3 tapestries and the last of only 1. Now we can confirm that the tapestries were woven over a period of several years and sent to Madrid in different times. I would now like to talk about the meaning of the convent and its surrounding area in the festive life of the city. The church and the convent were the place of many celebrations. The convent and its square became one of the eminent spaces of the city. The festive events in Madrid took place in the Royal Palace Square with number 1, the Major Square with number 2, and the square in front of the Descalzas Reales with number 3. Some of these events took place inside the church, but others were public events outside the convent. The church and the square were the stage of processions, magnificent visits, royal funerals, and acclamations of the king. During these events, both the interior of the church and also the outside of the convent were decorated. To the documents, it's possible to know how these decorations were realized and the role of the tapestries in them. In this old drawing, we can see the part of the square where some of the celebrations took place. All the historians who have studied this series agreed that it was used twice during the year. It's true that the main purpose of the tapestries was to decorate the church during the celebration of the Octave or Corpus Christi and the Good Friday, when the death of Christ is commemorated within Easter liturgy. It's also certain that Rubens designed the tapestries with these celebrations in mind. However, these were not the only occasions on which the tapestries were used. The documents regarding the celebrations that happened in Madrid during the 17th and 18th centuries report that the Rubens tapestries were present in many of them, even before the whole series arrived at the convent. In order to determine the way the tapestries were displayed inside the church, we must try to understand how it looked in the 17th century. Unfortunately, few documents of that time survive, neither plans nor drawings that reflect this appearance. The church was built between 1560 and 1564, but during the 17th century, several alterations were realized inside. Later, in the 18th century, further renovations took place in the church, including the introduction of tribunes, the elimination of steps in the presbytery, and the addition of new pulpits. In the 19th century, a fire burned the main altar and destroyed completely the altarpiece from the 16th century. This event and the previous renovation changed the interior appearance of the church irrevocably and probably brought an end to the custom of hanging the tapestries there. In the library of the Windsor Castle are some plans that show how the church looked in the 16th century. Although they are not very accurate, they are useful for understanding the appearance of the interior before the reforms. In them, we can see how the structure of Sotocoro, this area, looked, and we can see the presbytery with a great perron. The descriptions of the celebrations state that the interior of the church was a clear and open space in which the seats, tribunes, altars, and all the necessary elements could be freely arranged and rearranged, depending on the needs of each individual celebration. The courtly protocol of the 17th century dictated the way in which participants in the celebrations were to be placed within the church during ceremonies, in an arrangement which depended upon social status. A main place was always reserved for the king and his family, who were placed in a tribune especially designed for them. In this drawing, we can see the way in which the seats were arranged, in this case, in the Church of the Convent of the Encarnación, also a royal foundation in Madrid. Here, the royal tribune was placed in the side of the Gospel in an upper level. But in this other drawing, we can see another interior of a church, the one of the Hieronymus monastery, during an acclamation of the king. In this case, the royal tribune is placed to the right of the main altar, and we can see also some tapestries hanging and the audience seated. These two images show that the space of the church was modified according to each celebration and considering which personalities attended the ceremony. Since the foundation of the Church of the Descalzas, it was typical to arrange colgaduras, large curtains made with rich fabrics of different colors, to cover all the walls. There are also some old photographs that help us to see how the church looked with these curtains installed. This photograph from the beginning of the 20th century shows the decoration of the main altar during the celebration of the Miracle Virgin. We can see that the altarpiece is completely hidden behind the big curtains. In another picture from the first half of the 20th century, we can see again some curtains on the walls. In order to be able to analyze the positioning of the tapestries inside the church, it's necessary to compare the measurements of the walls as they were in 17th century with the dimensions of each tapestry in order to distribute them according to the existing spaces. As other investigators already did before me, I have analyzed each one of the tapestries, observing the style of the columns and the perspective of each of them. This work demonstrates that the series did not respond to a symmetrical disposition, nor is formed by two equal groups of tapestries that allow establishing equal positioning in the side walls of the temple. These are the four groups. And then we have these four groups. But I would like first to discuss the disposition of the tapestries around the main altar. In this area, there was a wide stairway, and the altar table was set on a platform higher than the floor of the rest of the church. The width of the presbytery is approximately 7 meters, and the space, you can see here, the width of the presbytery is approximately 7 meters width, and the space behind the altar is about 5 meters high. I believe that the principal tapestry of the series in which the triumph of the church is represented was made to decorate this frontal wall and to cover part of the altarpiece. Again, there are some facts that lead me to this hypothesis. This is an isolated tapestry. This was the idea of the presbytery. with the curtains and also with the tapestry, and the vast altar in the middle. As I say, this is an isolated tapestry which does not pair with another one, whose dimensions don't correspond with any other tapestry and whose composition demonstrates that it was designed to be seen from head-on. It's the only tapestry that possesses this characteristic. Moreover, its dimension, 7 meters wide and 5 meters high, fit perfectly in the wall of the presbytery. If we assume that a vast high altar was installed in this area, the available space could be perfectly covered by this tapestry. 2 other tapestries could form a part of the decoration of the presbytery. The tapestries of the fall of the manna and of Elijah and angel, with similar dimensions and composition, form a pair. Like the tapestry of the triumph of the church, they have Solomonic columns, and therefore they were designed to occupy the top level. Nevertheless, there are no other tapestries of similar dimensions to occupy the lower level beneath them. This is because they were designed for a space where there was no lower level, which is the case in the lateral walls of the presbytery, where there used to be auxiliary or side altars. And this was the appearance of these walls. But the documentation demonstrates that every ceremony had a certain protocol. In addition, the church was decorated of different way in each of them. This circumstance makes me think that the tapestries also could have been hung in different ways during different ceremonies. We can have an approximate idea of the type of decorations of the major altar from a drawing conserved in the gallery of the Uffizi. This drawing shows a decoration for a main altar that has been related with the Descalzes convent and the celebration of the Good Friday. Certainly, some elements, as the image of dead Christ and the archangels in vaulted niches, are present at the Descalzes too. At present, in Easter, the image of the Christ is still places together with other one of the Virgin, surrounded both for numerous decorative elements like steps, candlesticks, vases with flowers, supplementary altars, pyramids, etc. With regard to the group of 5 tapestries that appear in the sketch preserved in Chicago, it's the moment to realize certain truths. From the mentioned sketch, all scholars have previously agreed in affirming that the tapestries were designed to cover the main altar wall of the church. However, as I have discussed just a minute ago, already have demonstrated that 3 other tapestries were made to decorate this space, probably. For this reason, this sketch must be reassessed. The 4 rectangular tapestries that form a part of this composition measure 5 meters high by almost 330 of width, whereas the minor tapestry with the angels carrying the monstrance, it measures 350 by 311 of width. With this information, we can deduce that the arrangement proposed by Rubens would reach a width of almost 10 meters. However, if we look at the dimensions of the church, we can see that the presbytery offers a much smaller width of 7 meters, while the south wall offers about 10 meters. Thus, the south wall offers enough space to arrange the tapestries shown in the Chicago sketch. Some studies remarked upon the grating shown at the center of the Chicago sketch, but they continue in asserting that it shows shows a set of tapestries destined for the main altar wall. After enlarging the image, we can see perfectly the grid, and behind it, something like a pair of curtains that hangs from a circular element. The only grating that exists, and it has existed always in the church, is that of the choir of the nuns, placed in the upper part of the south wall. Now then, comparing the placement, this is the south wall. Comparing the placement proposed by Rubens with the current aspect of this wall, it turns out to be impossible to hang the tapestries in that way, with the grating just in the middle. However, we don't know how much Rubens actually knew about the interior of the church and its dimensions. Moreover, Rubens may not have known about the renovation of the choir around 1615. At that time, the architect Juan Gómez de Mora realized an architectural intervention that modified the choir, raising the floor of this one. If we bear in mind the previous disposition of the grating, then it would be possible to accept the distribution of the tapestries proposed by Rubens. And this is the solution for the current aspect of the south wall. Is thus the moment to reject the belief defended until now over these 5 tapestries and to stop naming them as the group of the altar, and clarifying that their destination was the south wall of the church. I believe also that it's better to call them the group of the adoration. In case of the lateral walls of the church, we must remember that the tapestries were covering the walls close to the curtains that helped to unify the interior aspect of the temple. The placement of the tapestries in the lateral walls did not follow equal schemes. This explains the lack of symmetry in the series noted by several investigators. As we have seen before, inside the church, symmetrical schemes were not kept in the disposition of seats, altars, or platforms, and this explains the structure of the series of tapestries. These lateral walls could be covered by tapestries arranged in 2 levels. The height of these walls is around 10 meters, for which the tapestries would be fit perfectly. These 4 tapestries could cover completely the wall on the right. This is the idea of this wall. While on the left wall, another group formed, in this case, by 3 tapestries, could have been arranged, because in this zone was the organ constructed in 1604. In these areas, we also find, in addition, 3 tapestries of small dimensions that follow a different concept, and they were thought to look like pictures. They might have occupied the lateral walls of the presbytery because the dimensions correspond with those of the pictures that were decorating these walls habitually. In them, the charity and the wisdom are represented framed both by a woven molding. And this is the appearance. There is another tapestry which is related to the same scheme. It's said to represent Franciscan asceticism, although the subject is not too clear. Again, we meet a tapestry thought to have been hung in isolation. In this case, the dimensions make me think that it was designed to cover some door, probably one of the 2 side doors of the church, like this. There is another tapestry that seems to be unrelated to the scheme and thus not paired with any other. I refer to the King David's tapestry. It's difficult to determine the location intended for this. Its structure made me think that it might form a part of the group of the adoration. I proposed this hypothesis some years ago, bearing in mind the architectural elements that frame this tapestry and that of the angels with the monstrance. Both were fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. But after verifying the dimensions of the south wall, it seems that there is no space to place this tapestry because its width of 5 meters is excessive. However, during the religious celebrations, platforms were constructed to provide elevated sitting areas for the royal family, but also others were made for the singers or for the chaplains. It seems to me to be possible that this tapestry fits and forms part of the decoration of the above-mentioned platforms. I believe that it might even have been destined to hang above the platform of the singer. And for this reason, he presents a topic related to the music. The last tapestry is that of the Abraham and Melchizedek. This one always raised problems where its placement was concerned. Its composition and dimensions don't easily help us to determine its role in the decorative program of the church. Already has been well studied Rubens' creative process and the moment in which he changed his mind with regard to this tapestry. In a certain moment, Rubens took the original Solomonic columns and replaced them with Doric ones, and simultaneously the scenes became wider. I dare raise a hypothesis. Originally, this tapestry might have formed a part of the group destined for the left wall of the church, placed over the triumph of the divine love. Possibly, Rubens had news of the existence of an organ in the above-mentioned wall and thus changed the tapestry's location. The change of columns and also of the perspective of the composition, thought now to be seen in a low level, makes me think that Rubens was designing this tapestry for the cloister or for the outside of the church. The documentary information demonstrates that in the 17th century, the tapestries were used as much on the exterior of the building as inside the church, as part of numerous celebrations. There are also references that led me to believe that they were hung on the interior of the church during long seasons. Nevertheless, the documentation of the 18th and 19th century, and also that of the 20th century, suggests that the tapestries were designed to decorate the walls of the cloister of the church. This fact can be related to the reforms that took place in the church during the 18th century when they greatly modified its appearance, with the constructions of new stable platforms, as well as with the presence of pulpits, lamps, and a new decoration of the walls with mouldings. Also, a new organ of vast dimensions was built. The use of the tapestries was stained in a background, made also it reflects a change in the artistic taste. As for the disposition of the tapestries in the cloister, it seems that an original iconographic program did not exist. The preserved documents regarding the decoration of the cloister state that the tapestries were hung one beside other one, without following a coherent pattern. The tapestries were hung excessively closely and remaining wrinkled. The same occurs about the display in the nearby square, where the Rubens tapestry shared the space with other series like the Conquest of Tunis, but in addition, those of Hercules and Pomona. And this is an image from the procession of Corpus Christi in Toledo, so you can see this appearance of the tapestries hanging in outside the cathedral. There still remain numerous aspects that must be studied about the disposition of the tapestries of Rubens in the convent of the Descalzas Reales of Madrid. I hope that this brief paper has offered new ideas on the matter, clearing up some doubts and providing answers to all questions. Thank you very much.
The question of Rubens's process, how he conceived of and curated the tapestries, is, as you know, one of the greatest mysteries that probably nearly every scholar of the Eucharist series has considered, or probably more appropriately struggled with. Your insights here, however, bring much richer voice to the conversation. Your intimate knowledge of the convent space and archival documentation, Anna, were unavailable to Nora DePorter, who wrote the seminal Corpus tome. And the technical information of the Fitzwilliam Bozzetti, Betsy, that you've presented was not anything that Julius Held or Charles Scribner, for example, really considered, maybe didn't even have available to them. And as we digest this information that you have so eloquently presented regarding ingenuity and creativity, I found myself wondering, is it appropriate to also consider who else exactly was involved? I mean, Betsy, you mentioned several times students, assistants, advisors. I mean, to you, to anyone, do we know who was in the studio around 1625 to 1628? Do we know who in the convent church could have been helping, corresponding?
In terms of who might have been active in the studio, I think it's difficult to tell. I think that Rubens, in a way, offered an open workshop space, and I just have the sense of people coming in and, at various levels to learn from the master and work with him on different projects. They might have been there for a period of a few months or a few years or a few weeks. So it's difficult to say who might have been assisting on this particular project.
And probably the difficulty, and I know there have been some efforts by Arnoud Baylis and Joost van der Aure to define the problem, as it were, which, as Anne, I believe you mentioned, also the idea that he was not subject to regulations from the guild to declare who was working in his studio, right? So that's a little bit difficult too. Anna, do we have any guesses about who is with...
About the studio?
In Spain, yeah. Or in the convent church even, who was corresponding with him about...
Well, the problem is there no too much documents. And in the 17th century, the convent was a very close place. And the nuns received the tapestries. For example, in the biography of Margarita de Austria, the cousin of Isabella, and Isabella sent the tapestries to her, it said that when the tapestries arrived, Margarita is very sorry because she's blind. Right. And she can't see these luxurious tapestries that the other nuns tell her how but there are no any persons in the convent, only the nuns.
Yes.
But there are a lot of people who work with the tapestries to hand, and this was very expensive. We have in the documents there are the expensives of the to hand and hanging, or I don't know if it's the word, the tapestries. Because the community use the tapestries when they have an occasion, they hang the tapestries in the church or also outside the church. And this was very expensive.
Oh, that's so interesting to think about contract workers.
And also they
hired.
ask for help to the king.
Oh, wonderful. I don't know, Kuhn, do you know who was in, Fiona, do you have ideas about who was in the shop at the time?
Max Rosen actually went into quite a bit of detail in that. And by the way, that book is now over 100 years old and you can download it for free now. But he mentioned that Justus van Egmond and Theodore van Tulden, Willem Panels and Jacob Moermans. And van Tulden, of course, we know because he has done all that beautiful engraving which you saw in the library. And if you've ever been to the Mauritshuis in The Hague, he's a fabulous painter also, and he was mentioned as his star, pupil is not the right word, his collaborator, I suppose.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Willem. I can keep asking questions because I thought these were fabulous, but I do want to open the floor too. Is there anyone who had... Anne, will you please step up to the mic?
Thank you so much for 2 excellent papers. My question is for Betsy, actually. I wondered if, having looked at the Buzzati and the Modelli and everything, whether you had any insights into Rubens' use of color as he developed the series, because he seemed to be thinking about color even in the in the Buzzati. But did he stick with what he started out with? Were there big shifts?
For the most part, but there are clearly identifiable changes in terms of, a garment might have been red in the initial sketch and then at some point it becomes green or blue. So I think he started with an idea but wasn't necessarily bonded to it. And I think, as he developed it in its entirety, he would get a better sense of the balance from one composition to the next and, within a single composition. And can I just...
Please.
One of the things that, Anna, I was so fascinated with your talk, and I was reminded of that line, "Everything you've ever known is wrong." And speaking for myself, that... your reconstruction of where the tapestries might have originally hung within the church, I found so very convincing and in many instances contradicts what scholars have put together based on an iconographic program. And 2 things occurred to me. One, that, primarily that an artist can, construct an iconographic program with the best of intent, but you send it off and you have absolutely no control over what happens to it when it arrives at its destination. And I was also very intrigued by the idea of hanging the tapestries in different positions for different celebrations and according to how you might want to divide or construct the space of what in the 17th century I understand was a very plain structure, how you might want to redesign it for an audience or a particular celebration.
When you read the documents with that speak about different ceremonies, the interior of the church was an open space without nothing, And when you read the arrangement for this ceremony, for example, for the Corpus Christi and also for the octave of the Corpus Christi, a special altar was set in the middle of the church, because it was a procession that began in the church and also continues through the cloister. And also in the cloister were 4 additional altars to put the monstrance. And also the seats change in different ceremonies. And also was very important if the royal family attend to the ceremony or don't attend.
Right.
And also foreign visitors. And, well, change is the most, a very important part of the work to prepare the ceremonies is to display the seats and the height of the seats. This is very important. It's not only the first row or the last row, but also the height.
Which is why the royal family would have been on
It's a tribune, always.
on a tribune with the tapestry below.
Probably. It's only an idea. I have not the document, but when I read some descriptions of these events in Madrid and also in other countries like Valladolid or Sevilla, it's common to prepare a royal tribune with rich fabrics or tapestries or this kind of things. And are only ideas.
But I think one of the difficulties and the handicaps that we've been working with up until now is trying to come up with one solution. Whereas, as you describe it, there are multiple solutions to how the tapestries could have been hung.
Yes. I became to this idea because, well, I have now very clear that the main tapestry with the trunk of the church was for the main altar. And also the meaning of this tapestry is different because resumes all the idea of the series and fits 7 meters, and it's the only place, and also is with an special to be seen to have on. And the other 2 with Elijah and the fall of the manna, I think are Eucharist prefigurations and fits very well in this presbytery. And also the 2 smaller tapestry-like paintings fits covering the portraits of Juana and Maria from Pantoja de la Cruz that in the 17th century was in these walls of the presbytery, because have no sense to have portraits in a decoration like in a theater. And also, as you have seen in the drawing of the decorations for the main altar with a lot of architecture elements, it was very amazing. A lot of things with candles in the church.
Virginia, would you like to approach the podium? Oh, no, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. There were intriguing correspondences between both papers, but I didn't follow the details closely enough. So, Betsy, the 3 pairs that you identified, do they match up with the arrangement that Anna proposed?
I don't think they do entirely.
Which is both the evangelist.
The 2 stacked this way, but I don't think the ones this way, which is something that we'll need to deal with. But that's why I was particularly intrigued by, the possibility of not one solution to the puzzle. So we can both be right.
Yes, of course.
Did you want to?
That was actually my question as well, is how can we put these together and see what, if your solution and your solution fit.
Right.
If I could ask one last question, you've both spoken to the fluidity of process, and that's emerging from the conversation so well, particularly in terms of Abraham and Melchizedek, right, and what happens. There's one bozzetto that never made it past bozzetto, right? The one in a private collection in New York and Richard Feigen, the Triumph of Hope, which is on a boat, right? Mm-hmm. Do you have thoughts about that? Both Nora DePorter and Charles Scribner imagined that that's why Abraham and Melchizedek changed to replace that one.
I'm not comfortable with that just because of the differences in the sort of composition that the bozzetto that Alex is referring to is just a very simple single-figure composition that relates more to the single-figure allegories that wind up as individual tapestries. So I rather group it with those sorts of images, and that at some point it just didn't get followed through. Rather than a tapestry, in the progression. And I don't know what your thoughts are.
No thoughts, because it's difficult. I don't know why Rubens changed in the middle of the process. Probably he had a new information, and also this tapestry of Abraham has also a different theme from the others. It's the only one who the false tapestry covers one completely, one column, like closing one scenes, or just closing. I feel it's, I don't know yet.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for your insightful papers.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to give everyone a 5-minute break, okay?